I am in search of William Shakespeare, the writer and the man. I find that in his lifetime nothing has been written about him as a person, only as a writer. Very odd. So I search for clues in the first collected works of Shakespeare, the first folio of 1623. Leonard Digges was a 17th century poet and translator. The first folio contains a poem attributed to Digges and dedicated to Shakespeare. He speaks of time dissolving Shakespeare's Stratford monument. By the way, the word monument with an I can mean a record of one's work and not just a statue of remembrance. Rival poet and playwright Ben Jonson, who had been hired by the book's benefactors, the Herbert brothers, to work on and perhaps organize the materials in the folio, calls Shakespeare the sweet swan of Avon. I can find no biographical information within the folio, and nothing about the writer in London. Strange. So I put two and two together, and I discover a small town, a 4 days' journey from London by horse, and I travel to the tiny hamlet of Stratford-upon-Avon, where the locals have such a thick accent it would hardly be understood in London. I go to the local church, Holy Trinity, and lo and behold, I find a memorial bust of a man named William Shakespeare. Not Shakespeare exactly, but certainly close enough. What troubles me is this memorial bust. After all, they're meant to depict one's occupation in life. But I can see no image of a writer here. He seems to be clutching a sack of grain. This is the original bust. It was reprinted more than once in books on Warwickshire shortly after the man's death. Then I learned that the locals referred to old Will simply as a grain dealer. These Stratford references tie him to grain, malt, corn, and hay. Well, perhaps he kept his writing a secret from them. Just did it in London, I suppose. Funny, his family never claimed to know him as a writer, nor did anyone in the town of Stratford, a town with only a few books, most of them Bibles. And then I find this troublesome grave inscription.
Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust, enclose it here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones.
Did the greatest poet of the English language write such doggerel? And why is his name not even on the stone? Perhaps I can find some answers in his will. Second best bed, silver gilt bowl, plate, jewels, household stuff, a sword. This is strange. You know that line bequeathing money for remembrance rings to his fellow actors, John Hemmings, Richard Burbage, and Henry Condell? The only mention in the will which connects him to the theater world? Well, those words have been inserted between two lines of the original will. In other words, Shakespeare had either initially forgotten his dearest and closest theater friends, or they were inserted at a later date by someone else. They are written in a different clerk's hand. Another strange thing about the will, no mention of his plays, half of which had not been published by that time, and no mention of his manuscripts, nor his shareholding interest in the Globe Theatre. But most importantly, no books. No books have ever emerged that bear his signature, bookplate, or any other such identifier. His children inherited no books, not even a family Bible. He bequeathed none to the local grammar school, which was the usual custom of book owners. Sir Philip Sidney, in his own will, bequeathed all of his books to court poets Fulke Greville and Edward Dyer. Books were extremely expensive. Where was his library? The Shakespeare works reveal an encyclopedic knowledge of botany, law, philosophy, astronomy, linguistics, the classics, music, medicine. They refer to more than 200 books, some of which were unavailable in England and could only be found on the continent, and then only in Greek, Latin, Spanish, Italian, and French. This is a list of more than 100 books, showing just some of the works he would have to have carefully studied to write the Shakespeare plays. The ones in red indicate Latin and French and Italian books not yet translated into English. So, he would have had to have known those languages too. By comparison, scholars have found over 200 books belonging to playwright Ben Jonson and early 17th century poet John Donne. I also find no indication that the Stratford man ever attended the local grammar school, and the records at England's only two universities indicate that he did not attend Oxford or Cambridge. The will signatures are troubling as well. Each is scribbled in a hand that appears never to have held pen to paper, and each time he scratched his name, he spelled it differently within the same document. Unlike other writers of the day, he never developed a distinctive signature. Traditional scholars try to explain this away by postulating that syphilis or a nerve disorder must have overtaken the poor man. But as German scholar Robert Dietable has shown, many wills, perhaps the majority from this period, open with a statement about the testator's health, whether in good health, ill health, or declining health. Shake-Speare's will confesses that he is in perfect health and memory. God be praised. And wills generally ended with the usual authenticating clause, in witness whereof I have hereunto put my hand and seal. The vast majority of literate men always both signed and sealed their wills. Men such as the writers John Marston, John Donne, and John Davies, as well as Shakespeare's fellow actors, John Hemmings, Henry Condell, Augustine Phillips, and Thomas Pope, and even Will Shakespeare's son-in-law, Dr. John Hall. In the first draft of Shakespeare's will, written in January 1616, it merely states that he will put my seal. When a man claimed to be in good health and then used only a seal, that was a pretty clear indicator that he was at least semi-illiterate and most likely could not write. In the revised will of March 1616, the clause was changed. The word seal was crossed out and replaced by the word hand, and it is followed by the scrawled signature. So, if Will Shakespeare had been in poor health, why would the clerk cross out the word seal and make the poor man sign his name? The more logical explanation is that he was in good health, and these scratches were the best he could ever do with a pen. As if to further corroborate this theory, Shakespeare's first biographer, John Aubrey, not a very reliable source, but still curiously enough, let slip the strange admission that Shakespeare was a company keeper, lived in Shoreditch, wouldn't be debauched, and if invited to write, he was in pain. And each of his scribblings appears to be pronounced Shakespeare. Yet references to the writer are clearly Shakespeare, long A in the first syllable, as if the name were a joke. Will Shake-Speare. Ben Jonson even described each of his rivals' lines as seeming to shake a lance, indicating awareness of the play on words. Yet the pronunciation of the Stratford man's name was quite uniform, a short A sound. In the 30 legal entries of the family name, found in the Stratford Register of Christenings, Marriages, and Burials, only one reproduces the name as Shakespeare, and that's for the christening of Will's daughter Susanna, who 20 years later is married as Susanna Shakespeare. Will's father, John, was Shakespeare. On Will's marriage documents, it was Shakespeare or Shagspeare. And well after the fame of the author, Will's daughter Judith gave birth to a son in 1616, and in honor of Grandpa, named him Shakespeare Quiney. Only once did the Shakespeare spelling appear on a play's title page, the 1608 quarto edition of King Lear, and it was corrected to Shakespeare in the next printing of 1616. Look at that big E in the middle. And why the hyphen? Hyphenizations were relatively abnormal for real Elizabethans, but they were often used in pseudonyms and character names, especially when using a verb-object combination such as Martin Marprelate, Thomas Cutwood, Dal Tearsheet, Simon Smellnave. The name William Shakespeare was often hyphenated. Out of the 48 individual quarto editions of the plays, 16 were published with no author's name. Of the 32 quartos that credited the bard, 15, or nearly half of them, hyphenated the name. However, in Stratford legal documents, the name was never hyphenated. Speaking of names, the Stratford man's parents could only sign their names with marks, as did Will Shakespeare's younger daughter, Judith. See that pigtail shape in the middle of the image? That's her mark. A scribe or attorney wrote the full name, Judith Shakespeare. His elder daughter, Susanna, did manage to sign her name. One example survives. This is the image given in Halliwell Phillips' Outlines of the Life of Shakespeare. Paleographer Emon Thompson described it as a painfully formed signature, which was probably the most that she was capable of doing with the pen. Note how the letter U is out of place compared to the following letters. The 3 A's are all different, as are the 2 N's and the final 2 L's. By contrast, Shakespeare's son-in-law, Dr. John Hall's signature, is what one would expect from a man who wrote in a clear Italian hand. Would that his father-in-law's signatures had been as clear and consistent. And so it appears, in addition to Shakespeare's parents being illiterate, his own daughters were also unable to write and probably to read, even though the plays abound with female characters who are well-read, versed in philosophy, and are in every way literate. Famed authorship researcher Charlton Ogburn points out that Dr. Hall's own casebooks, translated from Latin and published after his death, recorded personal details about many of his patients, including the famous writer Michael Drayton, whom Dr. Hall called an excellent poet. But he never found occasion to mention his supposedly famous father-in-law, Will Shakespeare. Another problem, why the anonymous quartos? If Shakespeare had traveled to London to become a rich and famous writer, why then were so many of his texts first published anonymously? Here are copies of Romeo and Juliet and Henry V, neither citing an author. This is a list of 29 Shakespeare works, first printed or reprinted in quarto. All are anonymous. What's going on? Perhaps the answer is to be found in another anonymous work, a poem that was written in 1640, urging silence on the matter. Wit's recreation is addressed
to Mr. William Shakespeare. Shakespeare, we must be silent in thy praise, 'cause our encomiums will but blast thy bays, which envy could not, that thou didst so well. Let thine own histories prove thy chronicle.
Why must we be silent in praising Shakespeare? And do his histories prove his own story? We shall see. Going back to the man's church monument to find answers only brings more questions, because it's been changed, altered to present the man formerly depicted as a grain dealer, now as a writer. The new bust portrays a man holding quill and paper, writing for some reason on a pillow, an odd writing surface, perhaps used because it resembles the grain sack previously depicted, and therefore would seem closer to the original, not cause so much notice among the locals. But why was it changed? And why does it now resemble that famous face from the first folio? Let's take a look at the so-called portrait of William Shakespeare. The engraver, Martin Droeshout, was a mere 15 years old when Shakespeare died. He had probably never met the man. Why would the publishers choose him to capture a stranger's likeness? The portrait itself is a joke. The head seems disengaged from the body and is disproportionately large. The unusual collar resembles a shield. The Dutch-cut hairdo looks like a bad wig and is longer on the man's left side than on his right. The mouth is too small and is off-center. There are 2 right eyes. The ear is malformed, and there is a line from the ear to the chin, suggesting a mask. The expression on the face is mask-like. The lighting comes from more than one source. And the subject of the portrait did not even take the time to shave. The doublet he is wearing is rather high-class and disproportionately small, but the oddest thing about it is that the right and left sides of the front of it are different. You see the large winged lapel on the figure's right side? It is actually what one would see if looking at the back of the left side. It is as if the sitter had two left hands. Is it meant to suggest that therefore he could not write, since left-handed people were corrected in those days? And unlike other portraits of the period, there is nothing here to suggest that the subject, if he existed, was a poet. On the other hand, Ben Jonson and Michael Drayton don laurel wreaths, while John Weaver tends to book and skull, as George Chapman sports a crown of Homer's complete works. This Shakespeare portrait does not suggest a writer, not even a man. Yet Droeshout's other engravings of the period are quite realistic. He was an accomplished and very busy artist, as his other works reveal. These are detailed portraits he made of poet John Donne and theologian John Fox. But Jonson himself, in his poem opposite the portrait, advises the reader to look not on his picture, but his book. Gainsborough said, "I never saw a stupider face." Mark Twain wrote it resembled nothing so much as it resembles a bladder. And look how the portrait was spoofed in the second printing of the sonnets many years later in 1640. Note the addition of a poetic cape, gloves, and laurel branch, and the question marks. This shadow is renowned Shakespeare's? Question mark. Soul of the age, the applause? Question. The delight? Question. Why were they lampooning the contents of the first folio? Maybe we can find answers by turning to the first biography of Shakespeare, a very brief account written in a book called Minutes of Lives by John Aubrey. There's not much here, however. Written in 1681, Aubrey is the first to tell us that Shakespeare hailed from Stratford. 65 years after Shakespeare's death, Aubrey writes that he had been a schoolmaster, poached deer, had a father who was a butcher, and wrote his name Bill in spit on each page. But none of this was true. Aubrey was not a very reliable biographer, for he also wrote that Ben Jonson had killed Christopher Marlowe. Aubrey's employer, Anthony Wood, called Aubrey
a shiftless person, roving and maggot-headed, and sometimes little better than crazed, who thought little, believed much, and confused everything.
Now, this is a problem because all subsequent biographies of Shakespeare were written over 100 years later, based upon erroneous facts and suspiciously tall tales. One biographer, for example, states that an actor, a Mr. Taylor of the Blackfriars Company, was being instructed by the author, Mr. Shake-Speare. The problem is that Taylor joined the company in 1619, well after Shakespeare's death. And built upon these fables are the modern biographies, full of he probably did this and he must have done that. What we do know for certain about the man from Stratford is surprisingly little. The Stratford Parish Register of Holy Trinity Church states that Shakespeare was born in 1564. The Bishop of Worcester's register has him engaged to Anna Whatley, and later states that he married Anne Hathaway. In London, a very strange court record has one William Waite filing a writ of protection for fear that he stood in danger of death and bodily hurt from one William Shakespeare and a man named Francis Langley. So it seems that while staying in London, Shakespeare was hanging with a pretty tough crowd. So who was Francis Langley? This may not be his actual likeness, but it will serve. Langley owned and operated the famous Swan Theatre and Shugging Den. So what was the great playwright and poet doing in such a circle? We have a Williamus Shakespeare suing one John Clayton for an overdue debt payment of £7 plus interest. Was the great William Shakespeare a moneylender? We find him listed as a London tax delinquent in the years 1591, 1599 and 1600. And back in Stratford, the man is recorded as hoarding 80 bushels of malt corn during a time of shortage. Perhaps his personal letters can shed some light on his life. Here is a letter from Richard Quiney requesting a £30 loan to my loving good friend and countryman, Mr. William Shake-Speare. A letter from Adrian Quiney to Richard asks him to
bring your money home if you bargain with William Shake-Speare.
Another from Abraham Sturley tells Quiney that
our countryman, Mr. William Shake-Speare, would procure us money, which I will like of, as I shall hear when, where, and how. And I pray, let not go that occasion, if it may sort to any indifferent conditions.
Again, a suggestion of the moneylender Shake-Speare. The Richard Quiney request is the only letter ever found written to this Will Shake-Speare. The letter was undelivered. Why? Well, let us examine the letters written by this prolific writer himself. That's right, there are none. Not one letter has ever been found written by anyone named William Shake-Speare, or for that matter, William Shakespeare. Isn't that odd? If we can't find anything in his handwriting, perhaps we can find his friends. Based upon the intimate dedications found in his poems, Venus and Adonis, and The Rape of Lucrece, we may assume that the writer Shakespeare had a very close relationship with nobleman Henry Roseley, Earl of Southampton. Southampton's biographer, Charlotte Stopes, admitted that she felt her life's work had failed because, despite 8 years of research, she could never find even one instance of a Will Shake-Speare or Shakespeare meeting Southampton. Yet the dedications would seem quite out of place if written by a commoner to a lord he had never met nor known quite intimately. Shakespeare's first folio was dedicated to two noble brethren, the Herbert brothers, Earls of Pembroke and Montgomery. There is no record that a Will Shake-Speare or Shakespeare ever met William Herbert, Earl of Pembroke. There is no record that a Will Shake-Speare or Shakespeare ever met Philip Herbert, Earl of Montgomery. What is odd is that there is indeed no record of William Shakespeare, the great playwright and poet, ever having met anyone. No one ever described him personally. No one ever wrote about seeing him out on the town, drunk in a gutter, eyes of blue, or were they green? Nothing. He was the man who never was. Why is that? A man of letters, Henry Peacham, published Minerva Britannia in 1612, a book of puzzling emblems and anagrams in honor of the great people of the Elizabethan and Jacobean days. The title refers to one who is Britain's Minerva, or Athena, its god of poetry and wisdom, who was born shaking a spear, whose helmet bestowed invisibility upon the wearer. Who was the Minerva of England, Britain's spear shaker? Does this cover depict him? Peacham knew people's secrets, but he also knew how to practice discretion. The Latin inscription tells us of an invisible writer seen only in the mind's eye. The drawing depicts a man writing from behind what appears to be a theater curtain. Was Peacham trying to tell us something about Shakespeare? Do we have the wrong man in Stratford? After all, his only connections to the writer are a similar name and the words Stratford and Avon appearing in the first folio, although not appearing together. Let's look at a poem from 1607, Mira, the Mother of Adonis, in which William Barkstead paid tribute to Shakespeare. Speaking of his muse, he writes,
But stay, my muse, in thine own confines keep, and wage not war with so dear-loved a neighbour, but, having sung thy day song, rest and sleep. Preserve thy small fame, and his greater favour. His song was worthy merit. Shakespeare he.
His song was worthy merit, past tense, in 1607. Remember, Shakespeare lived until 1616. Now let's go back to the Sonnets dedication, printed in 1609.
To the only begetter of these ensuing sonnets, Mr. W.H., all happiness, and that eternity promised by our ever-living poet.
Our ever-living poet sounds like he's already dead by 1609. Looking at the way books of the time usually acknowledge their author, as here in Othello and Henry IV, the name William Shakespeare appears between two lines on the title page. But on the sonnet's title page, there is no name, just the lines. Are we meant to read between them? Something else about the sonnets themselves. Several of them speak of the writer's name being forever unknown, while he constantly predicts that the poems themselves shall be remembered forever. Despite the fact that Sonnet 55 predicts,
Not marble nor the gilded monuments of princes shall outlive this powerful rhyme.
number 72 tells us,
After my death, dear love, forget me quite. My name be buried where my body is, and live no more to shame nor me nor you.
and 81 declares,
Your name from hence immortal life shall have, though I, once gone, to all the world must die. You still shall live, such virtue hath my pen.
if the poems will live on, why not the name of their author? Unless, of course, William Shakespeare wasn't his real name. But what about William Shakespeare being known as a famous actor? I've searched for evidence of that. Isn't it funny that there aren't hundreds of stories about his acting? Was he good, bad, a ham? The only evidence of his alleged acting career is the appearance of his name on 3 lists of actors. One from the play Every Man in His Humor, another from Sejanus, and a third from Shakespeare's own first folio. Now, why am I skeptical about these lists? Because despite the fact that the 2 individual plays were printed in 1598 and 1603, Shakespeare isn't mentioned as an actor in them until 1616, the year of the man's death. And the claim comes from Ben Jonson, the man who gave us half of the Stratford and Avon clues in the first folio, the man who was in position to add the actors list to the Shakespeare folio. So, the only evidence tying the writer Shakespeare to an acting career and to Stratford is Ben Jonson, a clever man to whom we shall return. I'm not the only doubter. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote that
Other admirable men have led lives in some sort of keeping with their thought. But this man, in wide contrast, that he was a jovial actor and manager. I cannot marry this fact to his verse.
Sir Derek Jacobi asked, where did this Shakespeare come from? Where did all that knowledge and eloquence and truth come from? I am highly suspicious of that gentleman from Stratford-on-Avon. Our playwright wasn't that fellow. Henry James claimed that
The divine William is the biggest and most successful fraud ever practiced on a patient world.
and a man by the name of Mark Twain, which I highly suspect is a pen name, declared,
Shakespeare had no prominence while he lived, and none until he had been dead 2 or 3 generations. The plays enjoyed high fame from the beginning, and if he wrote them, it seems a pity the world did not find it out. He ought to have explained that he was the author, and not merely a nom de plume for another man to hide behind. I only believed Bacon wrote Shakespeare, whereas I knew Shakespeare didn't.
so, where is the definitive evidence, other than the few circumstantial shreds we've seen, that the writer Shakespeare was the man from Stratford? We know, for example, that based upon the many exact details about Italian cities in the works, whoever wrote them had to have known Italy quite well. The Stratford man never left England. He never set foot on a trail leading farther than to London. But where is his literary trail? Where is the evidence that he ever wrote anything? His books, his manuscripts, his patrons? Now, some say we have scant evidence from any writer of the period. Records were few, were lost, burned. Well, let's see if that's true. Diana Price, in her book Shakespeare's Unorthodox Biography, has traced the literary trails of 24 authors of the period. For 17 of the 24, we have clear evidence of their education. Shakespeare is not on this list. There is evidence of correspondence, especially on literary matters, for 15 of the 24. Shakespeare is absent from this list as well. We have proof that 15 of these writers were paid to write, nothing for Shakespeare. 16 left behind direct evidence of a relationship with a patron, not Shakespeare. Manuscripts from 10 of these writers have survived, yet not one page from the greatest of the age. 15 others left inscriptions, receipts, and letters on literary matters. 21 wrote commendatory verses. Strange, Shakespeare was again silent. All of these men, with the exception of the best, had been referred to personally as a writer. We have proof that 10 of them owned books, and evidence has been found showing that 10 of the 24 were referred to at the time of their deaths as writers. In 1616, when the man from Stratford died, presumably the favorite playwright of Queen Elizabeth and King James, two monarchs who, by the way, never even mentioned the name Shakespeare as far as we know, what happened in London was nothing. No memorial service, no parade, not one member of the London theater world mourned his passing. As Justice John Paul Stevens noted, perhaps the greatest literary genius in the country's history did not merit a crypt in Westminster Abbey or a eulogy penned by King James, but it does seem odd that not even a cocker spaniel or a dachshund made any noise at all when he passed from the scene. Also curious is the fact that Shakespeare appears to have been the only Elizabethan poet at the time who did not write a eulogy mourning the death of his favorite patron, Queen Elizabeth. In England's Mourning Garment, fellow poet Henry Chettle even reprimands him in print to drop from his honeyed muse one sable tear to mourn her death that graced his desert. But Shakespeare's own silence on the matter was deafening. Since Shakespeare's name is not on one of these lists, proving a literary trail, and since he seems to have had no connection to Lord Southampton nor the Herbert brothers, what if we were to suppose that the name William Shakespeare was a pseudonym, a cover for someone who wished to remain anonymous? Pseudonyms were not unusual in Elizabethan times. Taleboys Dimmock used the pseudonym Thomas Cutwood. Richard Rowlands was R. Verstegen. Sir William Vaughan used the name Orpheus Jr. John Marsden hid himself under the pseudonyms W. Kinsater and Theriomastix. To this day, we don't know the true identities of Marforius, Cuthbert Currynave, Martin Mar Prelate, or Pasquale Cavaliero of England. 17th century poet Richard Brathwaite, who published under the pen name Corymbius, a pseudonym not discovered until 200 years later, in 1818, even wrote in 1614 that the finest plays of the Elizabethan age were shadowed in a borrowed name. About whom could he be referring? Elizabethan satirist Joseph Hall published a series of pamphlets in 1597 and 98 that lambasted an author whom he claimed shifted his writings to another's name. He went on to hint that this mysterious author was the same man who had written Shakespeare's epic poem Venus and Adonis. In other words, Hall suggested the real author was using the name William Shakespeare as a protective screen to hide his identity. In Thomas Vickers' 1628 Manual of Rhetoric, to a recent list of outstanding English poets, he suggests, "To these, I believe, should be added that famous poet who takes his name from shaking and spear. Well, if he takes a name, it was not a given name. We are so used to the name Will Shakespeare, I think we've lost the sense of how apt a pen name it really is. And it should not be forgotten that the famous classical goddess Athena was the divine protector of Athens and the arts, forever associated with shaking a spear and wearing a visor of invisibility. Is there a reference to William Shakespeare's invisibility found in Henry IV, Part 2, in the gratuitous non-speaking character of William Visor? In 1875, Charles W. Bardsley proposed that the name Shakespeare belonged to a class of nicknames in Renaissance England given to lower-class officials some centuries ago, and were hints at their officious and meddlesome character of their duties. Such nicknames generally referred to their implement or badge of office, with the additional wag or shake. Thus we find shake-buckler, shake-lock, wagstaff, wagtail, waghorn, and wagspear. In a contemporary allusion to the author Shakespeare, fellow writer John Davies refers to Shakespeare as our English Terence, but in doing so, Davies is making allusion to the well-known Renaissance belief that Terence was actually the front man for the aristocratic Roman writer Scipio. So, assuming a pseudonym, and based upon a close reading of the works, what characteristics would the real Shakespeare need to possess? A superior education, a maturity, a recognized genius, an intense sensitivity, a talent for lyric poetry, an apparent eccentricity, an enthusiasm for the theater, an aristocratic background, doubts about women, improvidence in money matters, an enthusiasm for Italy, music, and sport, a knowledge of Latin, Greek, Italian, French, astronomy, physics, anatomy, literature, and mythology. The plays themselves demonstrate an intimate grasp of the complexities of the inner workings of Queen Elizabeth's court, and of law, falconry, history, military affairs, and royal gossip. Walt Whitman described Shakespeare's works as having been
conceived out of the fullest heat and pulse of European feudalism, personifying in unparalleled ways the medieval aristocracy, its towering spirit of ruthless and gigantic caste, its own peculiar air and arrogance. No mere imitation, one of the wolfish earls so plenteous in the plays themselves, or some born descendant and knower, might seem to be the true author of those amazing works. I am firm against Shakespeare. I mean the Avon man. It is my final belief that the Shakespearean plays were written by another hand than Shakespeare's. The Shakespeare case is about closed.
Charlie Chaplin noticed that
in the works of the greatest geniuses, humble beginnings will reveal themselves somewhere, but one cannot trace the slightest sign of them in Shakespeare. Whoever wrote them had an aristocratic attitude.
knowing that many Elizabethan texts held secret clues and riddles included for amusement or revelation, let's again look at the 1609 Sonnets dedication. Remember that ever-living poet reference? Well, in that same year, the Shakespeare play Troilus and Cressida was printed in two forms. One had no introductory material, but the other had a very strange preface, which warned the public to buy up Shakespeare's plays before a new Grand Inquisition removed them from public sale. What can we make of this puzzling title? A never writer to an ever reader. News. There's that ever again, our ever-living poet. The odd thing about this dedication is the layout. It is very different than printer Thomas Thorpe's other dedication pages. All capital letters, a period after each word, and the page seems to be laid out in three inverted pyramids, all of differing line lengths. The first pyramid is made up of 6 lines, the second only 2, and the third pyramid is 4 lines. This can be no accident. There must be a reason, If one were to lay out 3 triangles using 12 lines, one would uniformly make them 4 lines each. But what if this were a code? As William F. Friedman points out in his Shakespearean Ciphers Examined, acrostics and hidden messages were not unusual in Elizabethan printings. Cryptography had prospered during the Middle Ages and was well guarded in monasteries and in the secret archives of kings and queens. It was often used by writers in England and on the continent. Noted mathematician, astronomer, advisor, and tutor to Queen Elizabeth, John Dee, was among the first to use ciphers to encode secret messages in literature, as did philosopher and statesman Sir Francis Bacon. And so what if the sonnet's dedication were laid out to suggest a code? 6 lines, 2 lines, 4 lines, 6, 2, 4. Let's look at every 6th word, then 2nd word, then 4th. If this should make any sense at all, then the odds of it being an accident would be astronomical. With the 624 code, discovered recently by English physicist Dr. John Rowlett, it reads, "These sonnets all by ever the 4th." And if you continue to the printer Thomas Thorpe's initials, as American Keith Cole has suggested, you get "These sonnets all by ever the 4th T." Ever again, ever-living poet, an ever-writer, ever the 40. But who is ever the 40? Well, whomever he is Shakespeare. To find him, let's examine his so-called first work, the narrative poem Venus and Adonis, written in a very unique style. What's strange is that this supposed first heir of Shakespeare's invention is a fully developed work. So where is the early Shakespeare material? Let's search for a writer of anonymous or pseudonymous poems that were written in the same unusual style as Venus and Adonis, someone who stopped publishing such works after the name Shakespeare began. English schoolmaster J. Thomas Loney did just that, and he discovered a poem that matched the iambic pentameter as well as the imagery of Shakespeare, a poem called Women's Changeableness.
If women could be fair and yet not fond, or that their love were firm, not fickle still, I would not marvel that they made men bond by service long to purchase their good will. But when I see how frail those creatures are, I laugh that men forget themselves so far. To mark the choice they make, and how they change, how oft from Phoebus do they fly to Pan, unsettled still, like haggards wild they range, these gentle birds that fly from man to man. Who would not scorn and shake them from the fist, and let them fly, fair fools, which way they list? Yet for our sport we fawn and flatter both, to pass the time when nothing else can please, and train them to our lure with subtle oath, till, weary of their wiles, ourselves we ease. And then we say, when we their fancy try, to play with fools, oh, what a fool was I!
Mr. Loney found that this poem had been written by a young Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. In looking him up in the National Dictionary of Biography, he found Oxford described as an aristocrat with a violent and perverse temper and an eccentric taste in dress, reckless, with a genuine taste in music, a patron of actors, and one of the best writers at court. In the 1586 William Webb book, A Discourse of English Poetry, Oxford was listed as the most excellent among the rest of lords and gentlemen with poetic skills in the Queen's court. In Francis Mere's Palaestamia, published in 1598, Oxford's name is first in a list of playwrights best for comedy. He's called the greatest writer of comedies, most excellent among the rest, and yet it would appear that no plays of his have survived. How is this possible? Then Mr. Loney discovered how. He read in the 1589 The Art of English Poesy, perhaps by George Putnam, we really don't know for sure, even he didn't use his own name. that some courtiers write well, but suppress it, or else suffered it to be published without their own names to it, as it were a discredit for a gentleman to seem learned, and to show himself amorous of any good art. And some noblemen have written excellently well, as it would appear, if their doings could be found out, and made public with the rest, of which number is first that noble gentleman Edward, Earl of Oxford. So, noblemen used pseudonyms for the sake of honor. Many members of the top rungs of the Tudor aristocracy had outstanding reputations as poets, but none of them published their creative works. The Earl of Surrey, Henry Howard's attributed poems were published in miscellanies only after his death. So were Thomas, Baron Lord Vaux. Sir Philip Sidney, Sir Walter Raleigh, Sir Edward Dyer, and Sir Fulk Greville all earned reputations as writers, but none of them published their own works. Greville recorded his reluctance to see any of his plays published, even posthumously. Now, if Edward de Vere wrote under the pen name William Shakespeare, no great conspiracy or cover-up would be required. It would have been an open secret, known only among the tight-lipped nobility of the time. And Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, was no ordinary nobleman. His honorary title was Lord Great Chamberlain of England. He was the premier earl of the realm, first a ward and then son-in-law to William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, Queen Elizabeth's most powerful minister. He was reputedly one of the Queen's lovers. There were 33 literary works dedicated to him, an unusually high number. Gabriel Harvey even published a Latin address to Lord Oxford that he gave to the Earl before Queen and Court. He spoke of de Vere's splendid fame, a more grandiloquent poet than I, with a mind cultivated by Phoebus Apollo, inspired by French and Italian muses, with Minerva, that's Pallas Athena, concealed in thy right hand. The address concludes, your eyes flash fire, your will shakes spears. He was the 17th Earl of Oxford. His name was Edward Vere, shortened to E. Vere. Ever, our ever-living poet, an E. Vere writer to an E. Vere reader, these sonnets all by Ever the 40. And, as it happens, young Edward de Vere is considered by many to have been the anonymous author of poems in Willoughby a Zavisa, 1594, and 100 Sundry Flowers, 1573, who signed his work Ever or Never. Contemporary poet Richard Barnfield, in the 1598 Poem in Divers Humours, wrote, and Shake-Speare thou, whose honey-flowing vein, pleasing the world, thy praises doth obtain, live ever you, at least in fame, live ever. Well may the body die, but fame dies never. And John Marston, who spent more than a year pseudonymously exchanging satirical barbs with Joseph Hall, implying that the writer of Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucrece had masked his identity, hailed the great unacknowledged writer in his 1598 Scourge of Villainy. Far fly thy fame, most of me beloved, whose silent name one letter bounds. Thy true judicial style I ever honor, and, if my love beguile not much my hopes, then thy unvalued worth shall mount fair place when apes are turned forth. Note that in addition to Marston telling us that the writer of the Shakespeare works was of unvalued worth, perhaps because he lived unrecognized, he also gave us the clue that the secret writer's silent name is bound by one letter, like the letter E, for example, in Edward Vere. And in Sonnet 76, Shakespeare himself tells us that every word doth almost tell my name, every word being but for one letter, an anagram for Edward Vere. And while he was the 17th Earl of Oxford, some consider him to have been the man referred to as number 40 in the secret correspondence between Elizabeth's Secretary of State, Robert Cecil, and King James of Scotland in their letters which prepared the way for the accession of James to the throne of England. Thus, the reference to ever the 40. By the way, the 624 code was not random, for it is the number of letters in the name Edward de Vere. As schoolmaster Loney began to research the life of this nobleman, he found amazing similarities to the lives portrayed in the sonnets and plays. De Vere did attend school. He attended Cambridge University at the age of 8. He then went to Oxford University. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree at 14 and his master's at 16. He was tutored by the best scholars and intellectuals of Europe and studied law at the Inns of Court, which was most known for its theatricals. He was a member of the House of Lords and the Privy Council. He was an accomplished athlete and won all 3 jousting tournaments at court, so he was an expert spear shaker. His uncle was Arthur Golding, whose translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses is considered to be Shakespeare's greatest influence. Another uncle, Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, actually invented the sonnet form used and popularized by Shakespeare. The Geneva Bible was the one used by Shakespeare. The Folger Shakespeare Library owns a copy of a Geneva Bible containing notations and marginalia that bear a striking correspondence to passages, themes, and image clusters found in Shakespeare's canon. As outlined in Dr. Roger Strittmatter's book on the topic, of the more than 1,000 annotations found in this particular Bible, over 25% are also found in Shakespeare's plays and poems. But this particular copy of the Bible, full of Shakespearean underlinings and notations, happened to have been owned by a teenage Edward de Vere, who combed the scriptures looking for passages dealing with the doing of good work in secret. The same theme found in Sonnet 72, "My name be buried where my body is." Like his father before him, Edward de Vere was a patron to his own acting companies. In fact, he supported 2 of them. The acting company considered to be Shakespeare's was called the Chamberlain's Men. There were 2 chamberlains in Elizabeth's court. The first was a Lord Chamberlain, a man who managed the Queen's household and took little personal interest in the theater. Most believe this man to have been Shakespeare's patron, a man, incidentally, who tried his hardest to get the Blackfriars Theatre, where the Shakespeare plays were presented, permanently closed down. However, de Vere held the title of Lord Great Chamberlain of England and was the more likely patron of Shakespeare's company. In addition to generously supporting many writers financially, Edward de Vere led a new literary movement made up of poets called the Euphuists, who contributed greatly to a reform of the English language by liberally coining words with Latin, Italian, and French roots, using classical mythology and allusion, mostly from Ovid, and frequently forsaking plot to celebrate ingenious wordiness. In other words, elements often found in Shakespeare's own works. Mark Anderson's book, Shakespeare by Another Name, details the life of Edward de Vere, whose father died when young Edward was only 12. He was then raised in Queen Elizabeth's court by William Cecil, Lord Treasurer of England. Master of the Court of Wards and well-known keeper of spies, the man recognized by traditional scholars as the historical prototype for Hamlet's Polonius. Later, in a troubled marriage with Cecil's daughter Anne, after malicious rumors of her infidelity, the couple separated for 5 years. Gossip was later spread that de Vere's wife had tricked him into sleeping with her rather than with his mistress, the famous bed trick which begot their first child. At 40, de Vere faced financial doom and was forced to disperse his ancestral lands among his 3 daughters, facing King Lear's future of landless destitution. His sister was a wild fireball who met her match in a brash swashbuckler who wooed and wed her, a courtship spoofed in the Taming of the Shrew. His beloved cousin was executed for attempting to overthrow the queen, and the fate of his cousin's 3 sons is dramatized in As You Like It. De Vere's eldest daughter faced a lengthy and tangled marriage do-si-do with 2 changeable grooms, a courtship illustrated in A Midsummer Night's Dream. And his own courtship was precisely mirrored down to the dowry amounts and the terms of the marriage contract in The Merry Wives of Windsor. Young Oxford lived in Venice during his 20s, visiting the cities in France and Italy that would become the setting for over a dozen Shakespeare plays. His brother-in-law, the shrew tamer, visited the Danish court at Elsinore. A memo at the British Library reveals details of a banquet he attended with Danish courtiers named Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. Hamlet appears to be the most autobiographical play. At 26, Edward de Vere was off on his travels through Europe. Before leaving England, he left his dearest cousin in charge of his estates, a man named Horatio. While traveling through France, de Vere witnessed a Teutonic prince parading his troops before him. Soon after, he boarded a ship and was taken by pirates, stripped naked, and left on the English shore. In Act 4 of Hamlet, in no known source text for the play, Hamlet witnesses invading Prince Fortinbras's troops, and then he boards a ship, which is taken by pirates, leaving a humiliated Hamlet stripped naked on the Danish shore. Shakespeare, it appears, was a very autobiographical playwright. By the way, many cite the Stratford man's naming his son Hamnet as proof of his connection to Hamlet. However, Hamnet Shakespeare was named after a neighbor of Will's called Hamnet Sadler, and not after the character in the play, who was a historical figure named Amleth, featured in the 12th century Danish play Amleth, Prince of Denmark. The true author simply anglicized the name Amleth into Hamlet. Another interesting fact that discounts Will Shakespeare's authorship of Hamlet is that writer Thomas Nash mentions a Hamlet on stage in 1589, much too early for the Stratford man to have written it. There are many other parallels in the life of the Earl of Oxford and in the characters of the plays. Plays, let's not forget, which often touch on the subject of disguise and mistaken identity. An extramarital affair involving Oxford resulted in London street battles of the 2 families, Elizabethan Montagues and Capulets. The Earl himself was dangerously wounded in a sword fight with his mistress' uncle, leaving him lame, as he wrote in a letter to Lord Burleigh. "When your lordship shall have best time and leisure, if I may know it, I will attend your lordship as well as a lame man may at your house." The condition is echoed in the sonnets.
So I, made lame by fortune's dearest spite, speak of my lameness, and I straight will halt, and strength by limping sway disabled.
Another strong piece of corroborative evidence that suggests Oxford wrote these works is discussed by Hank Whittemore, author of the Monument edition of the Sonnets. He points out that Sonnet 121 refers to a rather famous passage from Exodus. "And God said unto Moses, I am that I am." In this sonnet, Shakespeare vents an angry accusation about being spied upon by others who lie about him, and he asserts himself by saying, "'Tis better to be vile than vile esteemed. When not to be, receives reproach of being. And the just pleasure lost, which is so deemed, not by our feeling, but by others' seeing. For why should others' false adulterate eyes give salutation to my sportive blood? Or, on my frailties, why are frailer spies, which in their wills count bad what I think good? No, I am that I am, and they that level at my abuses reckon up their own." Whittemore states, "To my knowledge, only 2 individuals during the Elizabethan age declared in writing, 'I am that I am,' and apparently they did so within identical contexts: the author of Shakespeare's sonnets and Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. After composing a letter to his father-in-law William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, on 30 October 1584, Edward de Vere signed off in his own hand, adding a postscript bitterly protesting the chief minister's attempts to use his own servants to spy on him. "But I pray, my lord, leave that course, for I mean not to be your ward, nor your child. I serve her majesty, and I am that I am, and by alliance, near to your lordship, but free, and scorn to be offered that injury, to think I am so weak of government as to be ruled by servants, and not able to govern myself. If your lordship take and follow this course, you deceive yourself, and make me take another course than yet I have not thought of." Incidentally, when Oxford warns, "If your lordship take and follow this course, you make me take another course than yet I have not thought of," it appears that he anticipates King Lear's outburst against his two selfish daughters. "I will do such things. What they are yet, I know not, but they shall be the terrors of the earth." Several U.S. Supreme Court justices have weighed in on the case of who was Shakespeare. Justice Lewis F. Powell proclaimed that he had
never thought that the man of Stratford-on-Avon wrote the plays of Shakespeare. I know of no admissible evidence that he ever left England or was educated in the normal sense of the term. One must wonder, for example, how he could have written The Merchant of Venice.
According to Justice John Paul Stevens, Sandra Day O'Connor is persuaded that it definitely was not Shakespeare, and it's more likely de Vere than any other candidate. Justice Stevens supports Oxford as well, convinced, among other things, by the Stratford man's lack of books, together with de Vere's close ties to Lord Burleigh, and to the use of the famous bed trick found in 2 of the plays. But he concedes that even though there is no Santa Claus, it's still a wonderful myth. Justice Antonin Scalia remains a staunch supporter of Oxford, despite beratings from his wife. And Justice Harry A. Blackmun ruled, "If I had to cast my vote today, it would be for the Oxfordians." One argument to be made for a writer who wrote from his own worldview and experiences, rather than a playwright who got his material and phraseology second-hand, is that Shakespeare employed obscure legalistic metaphors, used idiomatic Italian phrases that he only partially translated, and demonstrated arcane knowledge of such subjects as heraldry and the law. As Marc-André Alexander explains, what distinguishes the formally learned from the unlearned, or those who acquire information from second-hand sources, is how information transforms into a deeper understanding. Mastery makes the terminology a part of one's worldview. And so, specialized terms enter the realm of metaphor. It is Shakespeare's use of metaphor that gives away his high status and vast life experience. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, Helena recalls her friendship with Hermia like coats and heraldry. Ben Jonson would string together words to create a scene full of legal mumbo-jumbo. Shakespeare revealed a mastery of such terms and would use them metaphorically. Shakespeare's favorite hawking metaphor was comparing a haggard or badly trained hawk to a wayward woman. As Caroline Spurgeon notes in her classic work on Shakespeare's imagery, he has more images of riding and of bird snaring and falconry than of any other forms of outdoor sport, and in both these groups there is evidence of personal experience. In one of the earliest accounts of William Shakespeare by a vicar of Stratford, the Reverend Dr. John Ward in 1662 notes in his diary that the great playwright wrote 2 plays a year, and for that had an allowance so large that he spent at the rate of £1,000 a year, which would be about 400,000 US dollars in today's currency. Quite a sum, considering the Stratford man's estates had been estimated at only around 200 or 300 pounds a year. On the other hand, in an odd parallel, Edward de Vere received an unexplained annuity from the notoriously thrifty Queen Elizabeth of exactly £1,000 a year, the purpose of which the Queen had ordered never to be divulged. In real life, De Vere borrowed 500 crowns in Venice and Padua from Baptista Negrone and Pasquino Spinola. In The Taming of the Shrew, the crowns of the rich Paduan gentleman Baptista Minola are often cited. In real life, 3 of Oxford's men, as a prank, ambushed some of Queen Elizabeth's messengers on the highway from Gravesend to Rochester in May of the 14th year of the Queen's reign. In Henry IV, Part 1, Prince Hal's men ambush messengers on the very same highway. And in the predecessor to this play, The Famous Victories of Henry V, which some scholars believe to be Shakespeare's earlier version of the story, the date is even mentioned as the 20th day of May last past, in the 14th year of the reign of our sovereign. In real life, Edward de Vere became ward of the crown upon the death of his noble father, and was raised in William Cecil's household. His apparent reluctance to marry the daughter of Cecil, not only because she was almost a sister to him, but perhaps because she was the child of a commoner, caused the Queen to elevate Cecil to the title of Lord Burleigh just prior to the wedding. The reluctant young Edward tried to forestall the marriage by attempting to flee to Italy, but his escape was foiled. After the wedding, we are told that the bed trick was employed. All of these events are dramatized in All's Well That Ends Well. In life, De Vere pledged a bond of £3,000, investing in ships seeking a northwest passage. The venture went bankrupt, and the villain who cheated Oxford was a man named Michael Locke. In The Merchant of Venice, Antonio borrows the same sum, 3,000 ducats, awaiting 3 ships full of riches. His venture appears to go bankrupt, and the villain is given the unusual name of Shylock. To the Elizabethans, shy meant shady or dishonest. Was the infamous Shylock in reality the shady Michael Locke? In real life, young Edward de Vere's mother, who appeared to have scant interaction with her son, remarried a man below her own status not long after her husband's death. Edward was then pushed into a relationship with Anne Cecil, daughter of the chief advisor to the monarch, a commoner under the sway of her verbose and pushy father. Lord Burleigh, sometimes called Polus or Pondus, was a meddlesome father-in-law whose motto was cor unum via una, meaning one-hearted. Hamlet resented his own mother's hasty remarriage to an inferior, and he too was paired with the daughter of the chief advisor to the monarch, a meddlesome old man and potential father-in-law named Polonius. The name had been changed from the original first quarto printing, where he was called Corambus, meaning double-hearted, a satirical reference to Burleigh's single-hearted motto, double-hearted meaning double-dealing. De Vere had to endure long-winded letters from Lord Burleigh, who spied upon Oxford and on his own son when he traveled abroad, just as Polonius spied upon Laertes. Like Hamlet, Oxford patronized an acting company and confided in his close cousin named Horatio. The book Cardanus' Comfort is thought by many to be the book Hamlet pores over in the play, as it is a key source text for the tragedy in which Hamlet's soliloquies, including the pivotal to be or not to be speech, draw upon and paraphrase. Note that Cardanus compares death to long travel. There is nothing that doth better or more truly prophesy the end of life than when a man dreameth that he doth travel and wander into far countries, and that he travelleth in countries unknown, without hope of return, in such sort naturally divining that this shortly will come to pass indeed. We are assured not only to sleep, but also to die. While Hamlet contemplates the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. To die to sleep no more, and by a sleep to say we end the heartaches and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished, to die, to sleep perchance to dream. 23-year-old Edward de Vere personally financed the first English translation of this book, which was dedicated to him, and in which he contributed the lengthy introduction and a prefatory poem, both filled with Shakespearean turns of phrase. Its title page reads, Cardenas Comfort, translated into English and published by commandment of the Right Honourable the Earl of Oxenford. Like Hamlet, Oxford was a patron of actors. In fact, he supported at least 2 companies. One was Oxford's Boys, and the other was the third and final playing company allowed by Queen Elizabeth to be permanently based in London. Their stage was at the Boar's Head Inn, which was, coincidentally, Falstaff's favorite drinking establishment. Orson Welles proclaimed,
I think Oxford wrote Shakespeare. If you don't agree, there are some awfully funny coincidences to explain away.
So, were the Elizabethans aware of these coincidences? Going back to that cryptic Minerva Britannia, the book that attempts to conceal, or perhaps reveal, the identity of Britain's god of poetry and wisdom? Do you remember that cover? What was that hidden writer writing? Well, if you rearrange the Latin anagram, it reads, Tibi nom de Vere. Thy name is de Vere. Shakespeare's unique vocabulary has been estimated at between 17,000 and 25,000 words. No one before or since has so enriched the English language with new words, and with so many of Latin and Greek root. The number of words he used only once, and never again, amounts to 50% more than are used in the entire Old Testament of the King James translation. By comparison, the complete King James Bible says all it needs to say in about 8,000 words. Researchers have discovered that words, frequently credited by the Oxford English Dictionary and other sources as having had their first usage in Shakespeare, have actually shown up much earlier, in Edward de Vere's personal letters. And scientists have observed that Shakespeare's record of astronomical knowledge acquired during the Elizabethan age, such as the discovery of Mars' retrograde orbit, and the record of major celestial events such as the supernova of 1572, all cease with events and discoveries made by mid-1604. William of Stratford, however, lived until 1616, long enough, if he were Shakespeare, to continue to record in the Shakespeare plays the discovery of sunspots, Jupiter's moons, the invention of the telescope, and other significant developments that occurred between 1604 and 1616. But the Shakespeare plays, while abundantly referential to such discoveries prior to 1604, are silent on those that were made after 1604. Edward de Vere died, or at least disappeared from England, on June 24th, 1604. June 24th, by the way, is 624. And about those 3 men with whom Shakespeare the writer was connected, each of these men, the Earls of Southampton, Pembroke, and Montgomery, were all at one time or another either engaged to or sought as husbands for one of Oxford's 3 daughters. Henry Roseley, Earl of Southampton, was unsuccessfully sought as a husband for Elizabeth Vere, and was such a close friend of the Vere family that he is depicted in this portrait with Oxford's son, the men being known as the 2 Fighting Henrys. Negotiations also failed between William Herbert, Earl of Pembroke, and Bridget Vere. However, Philip Herbert, Earl of Montgomery, did marry an Oxford daughter, Susan. These are the 2 men, remember, to whom Shakespeare's first folio was dedicated, the 2 men who put up a lot of money to print it. In other words, those responsible for the cumbersome and expensive task of gathering all those manuscripts and preserving the legacy of Shakespeare for eternity were members of the Edward de Vere family. A family, by the way, which included one distant relative. In Warwickshire, 5 miles west of Stratford-upon-Avon, lived Lady Elizabeth Trussell, owner of Billesley Manor, which housed a chamber known as the Shake-Speare Room, where local legend has it "As You Like It" was written. Lady Elizabeth was Edward de Vere's paternal grandmother, and through her was related a man named Will Shake-Speare, from Stratford-upon-Avon. Now, to answer the often posed question, why does it really matter who William Shakespeare was? After all, we have the plays and poems. One answer, other than the obvious desire to give the proper man the credit due him, is that we will have a better idea of when the plays were written and to what they refer. The traditional dating of the plays has been made to fit the Stratfordian man's timeline. Knowing that most plays were actually written much earlier illuminates the contemporary hidden allusions to queen and court. It does seem that the plays were written by an allowed fool, and if that is the case, it may very well explain the need for a pseudonym. In addition to Oxford's family being disgraced by a revelation that the great Earl wrote plays performed in public theaters, it may be, as the works became more and more popular, and as they contained more satire and ridicule of De Vere's very important and powerful contemporaries, such as Lord Burleigh, Robert Cecil, Sir Christopher Hatton, and even the Queen herself, it may be that Elizabeth perhaps insisted that these works, which had been printed and performed anonymously, at some point needed a fake name attached to them, so that the common people would not suspect that they were penned by a court insider. For if the author's identity would be revealed, the identity of his characters might also be revealed. And I doubt the Queen would have wanted the lower orders to view the public airing of the court's dirty laundry. However, the Shakespeare identity would have been a respected open secret among the top rungs of the Elizabethan aristocracy. The main reason that some deny Oxford his rightful recognition is because it has been said that a few of the plays make reference to events that happened after his death. But according to traditional Shakespeare scholar Kenneth Muir, in his 1978 book, The Sources of Shakespeare's Plays, from the 112 sources he cites as being certain or probable sources of the bard's works, only 5 appear after De Vere's death: Camden's Remains, Speed's History of Great Britain, Daniel's Arcadia Reformed, Strachey's True Declaration, and Jordain's Discovery of the Bermudas. But according to authorship researcher Peter Moore, these alleged sources may all be refuted. First, Muir himself admits that Camden's Remains is only a probable source, and many well-respected scholars, such as Chambers, say that Shakespeare's source for this oft-told parable was Plutarch. Speed's 1611 History of Great Britain is the only source of these 5 that Muir calls a certain source. He claims it was used for a portion of Henry VIII. This, despite the fact that he himself and most other authorities attribute that portion of the play to John Fletcher. Muir has Daniel's work as a probable source for Macbeth. However, he also gives an alternative source that was written much earlier, not to mention the fact that many believe Macbeth was altered by another hand after Shakespeare wrote it, which was a common practice for plays. It was also thought that Macbeth's mention of equivocation was a reference to the 1606 trial of Jesuit martyr Father Henry Garnet and his role in the Gunpowder Plot. However, the doctrine of equivocation was well known in England by at least the mid-1590s, when Father Robert Southwell was executed. That leaves only 2 works, which Muir calls probable sources for The Tempest: Strachey's True Declaration, 1610, and Jordain's A Discovery of the Bermudas, 1611, which are claimed sources only because they record, in quite generic terms, a Bermuda shipwreck. However, there are several alternative sources describing shipwrecks in the New World and in the Bermudas that were extant much earlier, including Richard Hakluyt's Voyages, Navigations, Trafics, and Discoveries of the English Nation, Volume 3, printed in 1600, which records an eyewitness account by Captain Henry May of a shipwreck in the Bermudas of a ship called the Edward Bonaventure, which had been owned, coincidentally, by a man named Edward de Vere. So, Kenneth Muir himself proves that Shakespeare read deeply in the works of the 1570s, 80s, and 90s, but seemed to lose interest in works written after Oxford's death in 1604. Ben Jonson, who helped put together the first folio, was under the employ of the Herbert brothers while working on the book. You remember the enigmatic references inserted into the book about Stratford and Avon? Well, Edward de Vere lived in a part of East London called Hackney, bordering the London suburb of Stratford. In addition, down the road from the Warwickshire Stratford-upon-Avon, de Vere owned the estate of Bilton Hall, bordering on one side the river of Avon, and on the other was the forest of Arden, reminiscent of As You Like It. Clever Ben Jonson. Both Stratford and Avon refer to both men. Officially, Edward de Vere was buried in Hackney, but his cousin Percival Golding, youngest son of Arthur, mysteriously wrote, only 20 years after the death, that the great Earl lieth buried at Westminster. You know, where every major poet of England lies buried, except for Shakespeare. No manuscripts of the Shakespeare plays have ever been found, which is unusual in and of itself. Were they destroyed? Working on the folio, Jonson would have most certainly had his hands on those elusive Shakespeare manuscripts, and the year he completed the work on the Shakespeare collection, his personal library of books and manuscripts was burned to the ground. And thus, shall the identity of William Shakespeare, the greatest soul of the age, ever truly be acknowledged? Or will his name be buried where his body is?